Hello and welcome. My name is Frank Gavin, the director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. I'm very happy to welcome you to our online event, Europe, Japan, and the United States in a Changing World. This is a follow-on to our event last year, Japan, the United States, and the Future of World Order. Both events are sponsored by Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we are extremely grateful for their generosity. We're especially thankful to our good friend and SAIS alum, Kentaro Fujimoto, who helped conceive of and shepherd this project. I also want to thank the amazing team at both the Kissinger Center and SAIS who made this event possible. Our gathering could not be more timely. We meet in the shadow of Russia's ongoing horrific invasion of Ukraine. We also meet at a time of unprecedented, vigorous response by Europe, Japan, and the United States, who have come together to impose harsh sanctions on Russia while providing support to Ukraine's resistance. This ongoing war and its unknown consequences generate many critical, difficult questions. These questions are not limited to Europe. Russia's war will no doubt have effects on any number of crucial issues, to security in East Asia, to the state of world order. They will also influence how the ties between the United States, Europe, and Japan develop in the years to come. We are lucky to have such an outstanding group of renowned scholars, analysts, and policymakers from Europe, Japan, and the United States to join us over the next few days to explore these important questions. We are also very lucky to have our new SAIS Dean, my good friend Jim Steinberg, to join our event. Most of you know his extraordinary biography in policy and scholarship. Jim was head of policy planning at the State Department and Deputy National Security Advisor during the Clinton administration. He later served as Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Jim has successfully led and transformed several important institutions and schools, all while authoring numerous books and articles. Jim is a true Renaissance man. Most important to me, however, he has been an active supporter and participant in the Kissinger Center's activities since its creation, and he has provided extraordinary insight and wisdom to our activities and great intellectual and personal support to me throughout my career, for which I am extremely grateful. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Dean Jim Steinberg to the screen.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks for that overly generous introduction. It's great to be with you here and with this really extraordinary group that you've assembled for this discussion over the next 2 days. And as you say, at a time when it just couldn't be more relevant and timely to reflect not only on the immediate crises that we're facing, but also the long-term implications of these events. And it's been a privilege for me to be a colleague of yours for nearly 20 years now, and particularly for your leadership of the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS, and how much you've done to build the center over the last 5 years. And I want to join Frank in thanking Kentaro Fujimoto, class of '97, the Director and Deputy Assistant Minister of Policy Coordination at the Gaimsho, for your support of this initiative. It's always great to have an opportunity to welcome SAIS alums back to campus, even if it's virtual. Kentaro is an example of our extraordinary group of SAIS alumni around the world who've gone along to lead extraordinary careers of great public service. And, you know, as you said, Frank, I mean, this couldn't be more timely. I imagine when you began to think about organizing this conference, it could never have occurred, I think, to any of us about how profound a moment of inflection we would be meeting at right now for the world, as you say, not just for Europe, but for Asia and everybody else. So I'm excited about the opportunity to listen and hear from our great group of panelists, this extraordinary group of presentations that we're going to hear over the next few days. And it's a great opportunity for us. My real honor here is that I'm going to have an opportunity to introduce my great friend and colleague, Kent Calder, the current interim vice dean for faculty affairs and an extraordinary example of the spirit of public service and scholarship, and joined in one extraordinary individual. But before I do, I have to say a word. I'm still, living in the moment of dealing with the tragic loss of Madeleine Albright, who was another great scholar practitioner. And I think we just can't say enough at this moment, at this time when the issues of freedom and democracy and human rights are in play, especially in her homeland area of Central Europe, to just pay tribute to Madeline and all that she did for the world. And, Kent, I think you join me in acknowledging that she's been an inspiration to all of us throughout her career. The ability to be someone who is at home as much in the academy as in the world of practice, and to have made such an impact. So it's in that spirit that I introduce Kent, who, as you all know here, is a towering figure in the field of U.S.-Japan relations. And as I say, someone who's made a mark both in the world of the academy and the world of practice. Here at SAIS, as I said, Kent is currently the Vice Dean of Academic Affairs at SAIS. He also leads the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. But you know that his career really is a trajectory that's a model for all of us. He did his PhD at Harvard. He was the first executive director of Harvard's program on U.S.-Japan relations back in 1979, 1980. He went on from there to teach for 2 decades at Princeton. And then it was a great privilege for us that he chose to make his next academic home at SAIS. He's a prolific scholar. He's authored many, many books, not just on Japan and East Asia, but on some of the broader global issues of our time, and has won numerous prizes for the works that he's authored, including being the FT Book of the Year on Politics just 2 years ago. But in addition to that incredible career of scholarship, he's also made a great contribution to the world of practice. Kent was at the embassy in Tokyo from 1996 to 2001, when Ambassador Mondale asked him to come over to serve as his special advisor. It was at that time that I got to know Kent quite well, because I was, as Frank said at the time, the Deputy National Security Advisor, and had an enormous opportunity to work with both Ambassador Mondale and Kent in fashioning and strengthening the U.S.-Japan relationship at a time when there were a lot of questions about what would happen to the U.S.-Japan relationship with the end of the Cold War. After Vice President Mondale left the embassy, Kent worked for Ambassador Tom Foley, who was a friend and mentor to both of us over many years, including the 28th G8 Summit in Okinawa, which I had the privilege of serving as the Sherpa on behalf of the United States. And throughout that time, Kent played an invaluable role to helping us at what I think was really an inflection moment in U.S.-Japan relations. And the closeness that we experience today and the response that Japan has shown to the current crisis, I think is a reflection of the groundwork that was laid by Kent and Ambassador Mondale and Ambassador Foley and so many others at this critical time. So I can think of nobody better to kick off this conference to my good friend and current Vice Dean, Kent Cole.
Thank you very much, Jim, for those kind words. They go too far, but I do appreciate them. And I should start exactly as you did, with a tribute to Secretary Albright. Behind me here in my office, I have a picture from her visit to Tokyo, which was a great memory for us. Today, I would like to speak just very briefly about the transformation which has occurred since those days, something which links the 3 parts of the trilateral world, of course, which we're going to be talking about in the panel to follow. But just a few words about the Eurasia factor in world affairs, which we are living with today in the shadow of the Ukraine war, but which has animated much of international relations for a century and more. The Eurasia factor, as I see, it's not the same thing as the immediate Russian threat or the Chinese threat, although it relates to both. It's a broader historic transformation of the Eurasian continent itself over the past 4 decades, dealing with geostrategic concerns dating back to Mackinder at the dawn of the 20th century. And of course, over the years, debates during the Cold War some of the overtures that Secretary Henry Kissinger made to China, the arms negotiations that were to follow in the post-Cold War world. Perhaps those became more restrained, and we lost the sense of the Eurasia factor in international affairs. But nevertheless, it's something which today, in the shadow of the Ukraine war, the interaction of China and Russia and Europe, and of course Japan, is something fundamental for world affairs. And in the background of all of this, of course, is simply the scale of Eurasia itself, stretching from Western Europe right across the continent to Japan. Eurasia is by far the largest continent on Earth, nearly 20% of the world's entire land surface. It's rich in natural resources, over a third of the world's conventional oil, almost half of its natural gas. Eurasia is also home to the largest population centers on Earth, except conspicuously, of course, for the United States. China, India, Indonesia, 3 of the 4 largest, and a majority by far of the top 10. Most of those are relatively lower income parts of the world that will be rising in importance in future. Eurasia finally also looms large in economic terms, with nearly half of global economic output. Now, it's certainly Eurasia in the aggregate is large, but as Big Brzezinski observed in the mid-1990s, cumulatively, Eurasia's power might virtually overshadow America's. Fortunately for America, Eurasia is too big to be politically won. Now, of course, the divisions are definitely there, but the interaction, diplomatic interaction, economic interaction, has deepened as we have seen over the years. And certainly the question of how coherent Eurasia is as a unit, the issue that animated Mackinder's thinking, something that Speakman was concerned about at the end of World War II, that animated Cold War strategists, has come back once again as a concern. The new Eurasia factor, to my mind, really flows from the extremely important structural changes that have occurred across the continent in the past 40 years, but particularly in the past 20. A rising China obviously is part of that. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia and China were roughly at the same economic scale. Today, China is 10 times the scale of Russia economically. A second dimension, a heterogeneous Europe of nearly 30 nations, contrasting sharply to the 6, much more concentrated to the West, that created the European Union in the 1950s. Thirdly, a weak, insecure Russia, with only 1/10 the GDP of China, but of course, a potent nuclear arsenal. And then finally, an island Japan, and yet a Japan immensely sophisticated in technological terms, with the world's largest GDP and deepening global concerns, as well as we will see in some of the presentations today, a more dynamic diplomacy and economy. Now, in this rebirth of a new Eurasian geopolitics, we certainly have already seen China-related dimensions, the 16+1 that China created, the supposedly indissoluble Sino-Russian entente that was confirmed before this war in the meeting of Xi Jinping and Putin before the Olympics. And yet, we've also seen the rebirth of a European Indo-Pacific diplomacy about. We'll hear more. We've seen a Japanese FTA as well as a Korean one with the European Union. We've seen increased Japanese dialogue with NATO. And we've seen a deepening and a dynamism to the G7, which it had not previously had. The Eurasian factor, no doubt, going forward, will hold the key to how China relates to the Ukraine war and to the subsequent reconstruction, regardless of the outcome. Yet, the Eurasian factor and expression through the Eurasian crisis before our eyes is also catalyzing European and Japanese and American cooperative, holistic responses to build the global figure. So we have, in the configuration of this Seyss-Kissinger Center conference, the issues of the moment and the chance to conceptualize them. I look forward very much to the proceedings today and use that as a segue to our first panel and the four distinguished speakers that will participate. Let me say just a word that demonstrates, I think, the increasing dynamism of the G7 going forward. Just in the last a few days, we have seen coordinated action by the G7 against the Russian central bank, and which held $400 to $500 billion in assets. 55% of those assets are held by G7 nations, only 17% by China. And the G7 nations, which are represented here, all of them, I guess, except Canada, have really played the key role in cooperation in realizing some sanctions in the financial area that appear likely to have extremely important implications. And this is in substantial part, of course, thanks to the involvement of the Europeans. Europe holds 34% of G7 assets with the Russian central bank. Japan 13%, the United States only 8%. So this is very much a matter of a multilateral action. Now, today, as our first participant in our panel dealing with the G7, and particularly the G7 in relationship to the current crisis, we have Professor Marina Henke, currently serving as director of the Center for International Security at the Hertie School in Berlin. She is a professor of international relations there and also director of the Center for International Security. Previously, she taught as associate professor with tenure at Northwestern University, and I'm proud to say also as a longtime faculty member of Princeton University that she also holds her PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton. Marina, it's a real pleasure to see you here with us today, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, Kent and Frank and Jim, for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So let me share my screen because I think that will make my presentation just a little easier. I hope you can see this now. So I'm based in Berlin. As Kent mentioned, I'm a professor at the Hertie School and the director of the Center for International Security. And as you might imagine, the Ukraine crisis hit Germany and also Berlin front and center. About 2 2 miles from where I sit right now is the main station here in Berlin, where we have thousands and thousands of Ukrainian refugees arrive every single day. So the war has really arrived here. And as many of you know, this has already triggered truly substantive changes in German security and defense policy. What I would like to focus on in my short presentation today, though, is Europe. And it's kind of really taken a European perspective and thinking through what type of options, of grand strategic options, Europe has. And, I think these options can be summarized threefold. So there is a grand strategic posture, which I term Transatlantic Renewal, a second one, which I term EU Strategic Autonomy, and then a third one, which I term Minimal Defense. What I would like to do in my 10 minutes is go over those three grand strategic options and then discuss the trade-offs, so the pros and cons, so to speak, of each grand strategic posture. And I will deliberately take a very European perspective here. So the pros and cons from a European point of view and not necessarily a Japanese or a US point of view. So let me start. The first grand strategic posture Europe could assume, I call transatlantic renewal. And why not transatlantic partnership or continuation? Because here, Europe needs to recognize and fully recognize that it needs the United States, that it cannot be autonomous. And of course, especially, and now this is has really come to light, of a resurgent Russia. And here European realization needs to involve that American support is no longer automatic, as it probably was during the Cold War. But if Europe wants to rely in the medium to long term on the United States for its security concerns with Russia, it also needs to help the United States with its most pressing security concern, and that is arguably China. So at the heart of this grand strategy lies a quid pro quo, and this quid pro quo is different than if there was a quid pro quo during the Cold War. Europe needs to curtail its exposure, and here in particular its economic exposure to China, and only in return it can expect that the United States takes then care of Europe's territorial defense needs. So how does this then look, in practice? What would the force structure entail? European forces would need to have a global reach. The US and Europe would deter together Russia, and then one could think of an option A and an option B. An option A would be that there would be a division of labor. Europe takes care of its larger neighborhood, also involving the Middle East and Africa, while the United States takes the forces out of this area and, basically focuses on the Pacific. In an option B, one could imagine as well that Europe does take on some kind of military role in the Indo-Pacific. But in the big picture of things, the US would lead grand strategic planning and Europe would more or less follow. And, Europe would, of course, also need to increase its defense spending in line with US demands. So what are the trade-offs here that Europe faces? Well, I think a big plus of this posture is, and Kent alluded to this, transatlantic unity would be almost unbeatable in the economic realm. So the US-EU economic space is still massive. It englobes 34.5% of global wealth and over 40% of global consumption. And so in this sense, it could set a lot of standards and could, throw this weight around in all sorts of ways. Of course, I think, what becomes very important specifically now in this kind of, in the narrative that has been created over Ukraine, that what holds the transatlantic community together, and also, of course, Japan, is a common history, common values, a common belief in democracy, certain norms, and also the prevalence of a lot of institutions. And for Europe, the United States actually, provides this kind of outside actors that helps various European states to find some kind of compromise, some kind of agreement. Like European states, some of them have all kind of a similar size and they like to bicker. And so they need a larger power, the United States, to create order even among European states. What's the big downside of this posture? Well, Europe needs to reduce its exposure to China. And in certain countries, and I'm particularly looking at Germany, this exposure is massive. Germany trades more with China than with the United States, and some big German companies, such as Volkswagen, they depend for over 40% of their sales, of their car sales, on the Chinese market. So if there is, like a real necessity to cut back those trade ties with China, it will have huge costs for German car makers and other industries. And, this also, of course, is something that relates to other European countries. And, the other big downside is that potentially it could be quite risky to put all European eggs in the US basket if there is another Trump-like presidency that openly questions the necessity of the transatlantic relationship of NATO, and that has some kind of like a restrained type of outlook on world politics. So what's an alternative? An alternative, of course, would be EU strategic autonomy. And here I'm deliberately using the term as well that very often is used in Brussels. So here, but I define it in a very specific way. And, I say that, this basically entails that Europe becomes politically, operationally, and military industrially autonomous. And, this in the big picture means that this autonomy is vis-a-vis the United States, because this is where, at least in the military industrial and also in the operational realm, Europe is dependent on the United States. So how would this then look like? Well, very heavy investments in European defense capabilities. European countries really need to join hands and harmonize European industries. And, there needs to be at least some kind of strategic thinking about a potential Euro deterrent force. And depending on the sectors, here I just have some data on missiles that the EU 27 countries use. For example, there's a very heavy dependence on US manufactured missiles. So, what are the trade-offs when it comes to EU strategic autonomy? Well, the clear benefit of this, and you can just summarize it as one sentence. If Europe is truly strategically autonomous, of course, it can maximize its own interests, and it doesn't necessarily need to follow American ideas or plans. So, if it wants to cooperate with Iran, it can cooperate with Iran and ignore US sanctions, and so on. If it wants to be neutral in the China question, it can be neutral in the China question. What are the downsides of EU strategic autonomy? Well, first and foremost, it's incredibly expensive to really build up the European militaries, and I'm not right now involved in strategic plans here in Germany, where they have just dedicated about 100 billion. And what becomes clearer and clearer is that actually that's just a drop in the bucket. And at the European level, it would be a very similar story. And the other, I think, very critical question is that in one form or another, if Europe really wants to be strategically autonomous, it needs to integrate further. So, you need to have some type of EU Security Council where there is some form of majority voting, or, we need to move towards some kind of federal system. But it's impossible to have, in my point of view, at least, a strategically autonomous EU if every single EU member state has a veto. That leaves us with the last strategic posture, which I call minimal defense. And here, this is basically the idea that Europe still prioritizes non-military means. That means, civilian or normative power or its economic weight. like what Europe has been kind of known for so far, at least when you look at, the EU from a Brussels perspective. You might also think that, like Europe under this grand strategic posture can take these neutral positions or neutrality. Some would even say this is like a massive Switzerland type of Europe. And, the only objective it needs, where it does need to have military capabilities, that's to deter Russia. And here, I theorize that it wouldn't necessarily be actually to deter Russia from any kind of incursion, but from an actual invasion of Western Europe. So in very concrete terms, that would actually entail that Europe needs to abandon the Baltics, because to defend the Baltics or to kind of reconquer the Baltics once the Russians have moved in is very, very difficult. But what Europe arguably could do is defend Poland, which is to a certain degree a little bit easier, because here really Russia needs to be on the offensive and Europe could be in the defense, and so it needs less armored brigades and so forth. And I'm happy to answer more precise questions on the strategic posture in the Q&A. And like in addition, probably if you really want to implement minimal defense, you also need this minimal European nuclear deterrent force. So what are here the trade-offs? Well, on the plus side is, that's at least, before the Ukraine crisis, a lot of surveys, and again, I'm looking at Germany, but also, when you look at some Scandinavian countries, this is arguably what most Europeans want. They're very attached to these kind of more civilian power, normative power tools, and still have a difficulty to fully, like embrace a military power. And, I know that, for example, France is a big exception. So I'm looking at kind of the other European states. And, one could argue that this is also the lowest common denominator among European countries. They can probably all agree on, like focusing on territorial defense. And of course, the downside is that, this deterrence framework might not work. We see a Russia that is incredibly aggressive. So it might actually not believe in the EU deterrent force. And, like in the big picture of things, of course, if you want to be this minimal defense actor, then, like you forego a certain degree of international influence. So I will stop here, like for now, I'm not making any concrete predictions where Europe is actually heading, because so many parts are moving. And I think really it very much depends on, how this Ukraine crisis will be settled. But I think Europe has, in the big picture of things, those three options. And I think it probably will settle in one form or another on one of them. So I will hand back to Kent. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marina. You've made some important points there. I know one question that I'm going to come back with you about, but later, perhaps in our Q&A, certainly is this question of China and Europe, given the heavy dependence, especially groups like the auto industry on China. How is that going to affect Europe's orientation or trade-offs among these three alternatives going forward? I know we'll have a fascinating discussion, but before that, we also have several really interesting papers and presentations by scholars who have an unusual combination of perspectives from the trilateral world. Our next speaker, Ms. Céline Pajon, is a research fellow and also the head of Japan research for EFRI, the French Institute of International Relations. So even though she's based in Paris as head of the Center for Asian Studies and also Japan research at EFRI, She also is affiliated with the Vrije Universiteit Brussels program in, if I'm not mistaken, in Brussels for the last couple of years. And in addition to this, she's also an international research fellow with the Cannon Institute for Global Studies in Tokyo, which I know myself very well is really an excellent and intellectually incisive think tank. Her specialty is Japanese foreign and defense policy, and she's going to be speaking to us today on the European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Céline, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thanks a lot, Professor Calder. That's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be greeted by you, because since my student year, I've been reading eagerly your many books on Japan. So I'm really happy to meeting you, at least virtually this time. So I would like to thank also the organizer for having me. I'm surrounded by a very large panel of brilliant colleagues, so I'm really happy to be here. So, as Professor Calder said, my paper aims to reflect on the recent developments regarding the European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So I know that it might look a bit odd to discuss the Indo-Pacific when the war is actually raging in Europe. But the challenges that we meet now in Europe are also present in Asia. So I will discuss it a little bit later on, but I think the two theaters can be very much connected in a way. So to come back to the Indo-Pacific, as you know, last September, the EU adopted its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. It's a recognition of the geopolitical and geoeconomic centrality of this area for its strategy and its strategic importance for Europe. And with this document, the EU commits to promote regional stability. Actually, it was really a tour de force to reach a consensus among the 27 member states for a common approach in a geographical area that is actually relatively distant from the concern of the majority of the European countries. That's really not the main priorities for much of the European countries. And security cooperation, because I will focus on security cooperation, is not actually presented as central in the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. It appears only at the 6th of the 7 priorities recommended by the EU. Nevertheless, last year we saw 3 European naval deployments to the Indo-Pacific from France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Not to mention the UK, but now with the Brexit, UK is out of the EU. And also, as you know, the same day the EU Indo-Pacific strategy was issued, the AUKUS partnership was also announced. So this was really a shock, of course, for France, but more broadly, I think, for the Europeans. And it questions the relevance of the European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So here I would like to try to assess the challenges and opportunities of the European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific and answer the questions: how can Europeans realistically contribute to the security of this region? So I will start with the challenges. I see 4 main variables that explains the variety of the European security interest regarding the Indo-Pacific. It's very complicated to find actually a consensus regarding the importance of the security in the Indo-Pacific for the Europeans. So the 4 factors. The first one is the priority given by Europeans to security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Indeed, most of the EU member states consider the Indo-Pacific first and foremost through the lens or the prism of the economics and not the security. The second factor is the military means available to each state. The EU per se, as you know, has no standing army, and few European states have sufficient military assets to deploy regularly in the region. So this is a limitative factor. The third element is the relationship with the United States. A greater proximity to the American ally favors support for European engagement in the Indo-Pacific that is actually requested and expected by Washington. And especially countries of Central and Eastern Europe hope to ensure, as a quid pro quo, a lasting American commitment to the security in Europe. So this resonates very much with the, what Professor Enkes discussed in presentations. Lastly, the relationship with China is also important. A greater economic and political proximity or dependence vis-à-vis China favors a more limited or less frontal security engagement vis-à-vis Beijing in the Indo-Pacific. And so therefore, these four variables were displayed in two recent episodes or case studies. First being the announcement of AUKUS and the subsequent European reaction, and the second being the European naval dispatches of last year. So first, AUKUS. The European support and solidarity with France in the wake of the AUKUS shock was actually less substantial than was expected in Paris. Actually, we've heard various criticism that has disapproved France's attempt to Europeanize the AUKUS crisis, and many European countries saw this actually as a bilateral matter, not a European question. And a significant number of European countries, as I said, are dependent on the US for their security, and therefore disapprove any tensions in the transatlantic relations. So it was not really positively seen. So the second case study is the naval deployment. So three deployments took place. The French amphibious group with the Mission Jeanne d'Arc, a German frigate was also dispatched, and a Dutch frigate. And these various dispatches were made in uncoordinated manner. The fact that the three countries went on their own indicates the operational challenges actually to coordinate with each other, but also point to clear differences in each country's approach. For example, the Dutch deployment was integrated into the British carrier battle groups, indicated the preference for maintaining the cooperation with the UK post-Brexit and with the US. For its part, Germany was very much cautious about the strategic message that its dispatch would send to its Chinese partner. And so it preferred to go alone also for other organizational and logistical reasons. So there's two cases question the alignments of European strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific and the ability of the Europeans to act together in the region. Finally, the Russian aggression of Russia is of course also putting a question mark on the EU security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. It is certainly diverting the attention of and efforts that were to be put on the concretization of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy from this year on. The EU priority will be to secure its immediate neighborhood, reassuring its member states and keeping Russia in check. But the current war also showed that the US continues to make the strategic rivalries with China as its first priority. And also, I believe, because the European interest and the global issues at stake in the Indo-Pacific will stay, the EU commitment to the region is also likely to endure. Also, the Ukraine crisis is highlighting the Chinese support to Russia and the growing multidimensional coordination between these two countries. And so to protect their security interests, the Europeans cannot turn away from China and from what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. So now I'm turning to the opportunities and look at what kind of security role Europe can play in the Indo-Pacific. So first, I would like to say that the European role as a security provider in the Indo-Pacific has a solid basis. Europe has territories in both the Indian and Pacific Ocean. It's the French overseas territory. This territory brings huge EEZ and thus also huge responsibility to protect this EEZ. In addition, the EU is dependent on the sea lane of communications for its trades and have important strategic and economic partners in the region. Moreover, the Europeans' inclusive vision for the Indo-Pacific and its security commitment are also widely expected and welcome in Asia by its Asian partners. And actually, the EU is already playing an important security role in the region, especially regarding maritime security and capacity building in law enforcement at sea. The EU has been combating piracy off the Horn of Africa and building maritime domain awareness capabilities in the Western Indian Ocean over the past 14 years. In recent years, the EU is expanding its cooperation to the Eastern Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. In addition, a coordination of European member states' activities in the region should bolster its contribution and impact. The concept of an EU coordinated maritime presence provides a new flexibility, a new tool for the EU to show the flag and set a multinational naval presence, evading the necessity to reach a consensus of all member states to act. The Paris Ministerial Forum last month decided to set up such a coordinated maritime presence in the northwestern Indian Ocean. This is an interesting focus because I think it nicely complements the US approach of the Indo-Pacific that actually geographically exclude this very area of the Western Indian Ocean. This shows how Europeans and Americans can share the burden in the region. And another way to look at the division of labor between with the US is to acknowledge that the European approach is less military driven, more comprehensive and quite strong on non-traditional security issues, governance, and normative aspects. Indeed, security should be understood broadly. Today, connectivity relates to prosperity, for sure, but also to norm shaping and strategic influence. Enhancing economic security, building up the resilience of regional countries in front of various crises, be it pandemics or the impacts of climate change, is as key for the security as more traditional types of challenges and risk. And the EU has significant assets and capacities to act in this dimension. Just to mention the initiative, the Global Gateway Initiative that was adopted late 2020 with a big packet of money to fund infrastructure and connectivity project in the world. So in conclusion, the study cases of AUKUS and the European naval dispatches show the reluctance of European partners to align with the Indo-Pacific approach that favor strategic autonomy at the expense of the relationship with Washington. Transatlantic coordination, particularly within NATO, is considered essential for acting in the security and defense field, including in the Indo-Pacific. Actually, the EU and the US recently set up a high-level dialogue on the Indo-Pacific, another one on China, and EU-US Trade and Technology Council that aims to harmonize their position on key areas pertaining to relation to China. So all this forms a kind of new architecture for the transatlantic partner to fine-tune their approach to the Indo-Pacific and also to China. In addition, I believe that the new US Indo-Pacific strategies that put a strong accent on working with partners, ensuring independence of choices of regional countries and providing common goods for the whole region seems to be more convergent with the European approach. And this should make also the cooperation easier. So the Indo-Pacific is wide and complex enough. It offers plenty of room for the Europeans and the US to coordinate initiative, work in synergy or complementarity, including in association with the Quad, for example, as Europeans are now more open to such kind of cooperation. And so if I refer to Marina's Anker's paper, a very good paper, by the way, a likely grand strategy scenario favorable to an EU security commitment to the Indo-Pacific, I believe, is the maintenance of a kind of strategic autonomy within a transatlantic renewal. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Céline. I must say I'm quite tempted. There's one question that I can't resist. Perhaps in the interest of time, we can go on and to address it later, but something that I hope you can think about. You've given us, I think, to me, an extremely interesting and detailed assessment of a rather intricate sort of multilateral architecture and multilateral initiatives of various kinds that the EU is undertaking, including, of course, France, that is a country that does have a direct territorial presence with Réunion and so on. People who know the issues well certainly appreciate that it has a key Indo-Pacific role. And obviously AUKUS, you alluded to AUKUS, and one can imagine that, and of course that is not regarded very well in Paris. And yet, if I understand you correctly, the sort of role that you are envisioning for Europe is a very different sort of thing than the AUKUS concept, which of course was very narrowly political, military, and oriented toward rather arcane and sensitive technologies. So I guess the question that I will want to ask you and raise for our conference really is whether several of these things are not actually complementary to each other. That somehow, some way, something like AUKUS maybe is needed in the Indo-Pacific, and maybe in a narrower form than previously was conceived by some of the other security relationships. And yet, what you say is really so important, particularly on the human security side, the economic security side, and then also regionally. You mentioned the Northwest Indian Ocean. To my mind, there's almost no serious consideration. Of course, it's strategically important toward the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, or and the Indian Ocean side. And yet, that's not an area of fundamental emphasis. So at least I come away from this feeling that maybe we're looking at multiple functions and roles that are complementary to each other. I don't know, do you think that that's possible? Is that a subject that's worth discussing?
Well, sure, there are plenty of elements to bring here. I think I highlighted the complementarity. And as I said, the Indo-Pacific is wide enough. One country cannot, look at all the issues. We really need to cooperate, to coordinate. I think one important question will be how to coordinate much of the upcoming initiative by the US, but also the existing framework for cooperation, what Japan is doing in the region, what India is doing in the region, Australia, the European, the US, how to bring that together, articulate it, coordinate it, to avoid overlaps and to be able to have a lasting effect in the region. But as you said, I think the EU can be much complementary to the US. When it comes to AUKUS and France, of course, the French Indo-Pacific strategy does not equal the European Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, it's natural that France has, it has territories. We have soldiers, troops and vessels in the region. We have sovereign interest. So that's natural that we have a kind of more military driven focus of the Indo-Pacific rather than compared to the EU. So France is embedded, is articulating its own Indo-Pacific strategy within the EU strategy, but with its own characteristic, meaning maritime security is really key. So and defense equipment cooperation and so on. That's why AUKUS was really a kind of blow for France, because more than the Indo-Pacific, it really questioned the trust, between France and key allies, US, UK, and Australia.
Yes, well, that certainly is easy to understand, and I look forward to more discussion on these issues a little later on. So thank you very much. Now, as our next participant, we are privileged to have Professor Satoru Mori from Hosei University. Professor Mori is currently Professor of International Politics and U.S. Foreign Policy at the Department of Global Politics of Hosei, of course, which is one of the finest Japanese universities. He also served as a visiting researcher at Princeton some years ago, 2014-15, if I recall, and has an important book on U.S. diplomatic history, the Vietnam War and Alliance Diplomacy, published by the University of Tokyo Press, which also has won a significant prize, the Hiroshi Shimizu Prize, and has done some English publications with Shinichi Kitaoka, I see, who's also another good friend, a mutual friend, who is now heading the Japanese Foreign Aid Agency. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, Professor Mori, and we look forward to your remarks that are going to deal with reconsolidating collective defense. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Calder. Before I begin, I would like to also thank Professor Gavin Fujimoto-san, Dean Steinberg, the Kissinger Institute, and all the organizers of this workshop for having me here today. This is my second time to participate in this workshop, and it's a real privilege to be able to speak among distinguished panelists today. So the title of my presentation today is Reconsolidating Collective Defense. And the basic question that I wanted to raise is how should the United States and its allies in Europe and Asia deal with escalation risks emanating from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So let me give you my bottom lines up front. Point number one is that there are risks of Russian escalation in Ukraine, and the conflict could expand to directly involve NATO, and that would have huge ramifications for Asia. So I believe it makes sense to have Japan fully consulted when NATO makes a decision on how to respond to Russian escalation, which I'm confident will happen. Point number two is that I believe that Japan should support NATO's decision on how to respond to Russian escalation and work in full lockstep with NATO when it comes to dealing with Russia. Point number three is that we should keep in mind that when we arrive on the verge of an escalation spiral over Ukraine, we should keep in mind that we have two strategic adversaries, not only Russia, but also China. Point number four is that cyber defense could become even more important as an isolated Russia could intensify and expand malicious cyber activities against sanction-imposing states. And there may be much room for collective defense in the area of cybersecurity and cyber defense. And my last point is that we should double down on our efforts to deter any potential Chinese aggression against Taiwan. There are many tasks to be undertaken, but I believe that deepening public debates is particularly important in order to clarify what roles US and allies are ready to play in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So please allow me to unpack very briefly some of these points. I want to start off by addressing the risks of escalation of the war in Ukraine. If Putin becomes increasingly frustrated by Ukrainian resistance, he could escalate in various directions, and we will have to be prepared to respond. I believe there are at least two possibilities. The first possibility is the one that has been discussed for a while. Putin could set up a false flag and use biological chemical weapons inside Ukraine. And if NATO responds by attacking Russian forces, Putin could retaliate by attacking bases and cities in neighboring countries such as Poland. And also, prior to using biological chemical weapons in Ukraine, Putin could also threaten that if NATO forces attack Russian forces in Ukraine, then he will consider using nuclear weapons at a place and time as it's choosing. So that's one kind of possibility of escalation. Another possibility is that in order to deal with the increasing economic hardship of Russia resulting from the economic sanctions, Putin could further intensify hacking and launch wide-spanning cyber attacks against maybe critical infrastructures of sanction-imposing states and demand that they lift sanctions. He could use also proxies and pretend that Russia is not involved and that cyber attacks are waged by third parties. And he could say that Russia could, quote unquote, help stop the attacks if sanctions are lifted and so forth. So the question of how we should respond to these kinds of possibilities or some similar situation involving escalation is an extremely difficult one. And honestly, I do not have clear-cut answers, but I would like to make several points. My first point with regard to Putin's threat to escalate vertically or horizontally, the consequences of any response to Russian use of biological chemical weapon in Ukraine or a Russian conventional attack on Poland will extend beyond NATO. NATO heads of state statement yesterday said that, quote, any use by Russia or a chemical or biological weapon would be unacceptable and result in severe consequences, unquote. We will have to see what severe consequences will mean, but if Russian forces use chemical biological weapons inside Ukraine, and NATO takes direct military action against Russian forces in Ukraine, that will dramatically change the security situation, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, and affect US allies like Japan as well. For instance, if Russian forces use chemical weapons in Ukraine, there is major uproar among NATO states, and leaders of NATO states decide to retaliate by attacking Russian forces in Ukraine. And if the Russians retaliate by attacking a NATO member state neighboring Ukraine like Poland, then Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty would be invoked. And that means that the United States will be on war footing, not only in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific. And this means that the Japan-US alliance will confront the Russian forces in the Northern Pacific, will have to face the Russian forces in the Northern Pacific. So all of this implies that any NATO decision regarding the response to Russian escalation in and around Ukraine should involve major US allies like Japan that would become involved in an expanded conflict resulting from Russian escalation. In this context, collective defense is collective in the sense that the US and its major allies should make a joint decision through full consultation about how to respond to Russian escalation, which I am sure the Biden administration will do. Japan has imposed a series of sanctions on Russia and has been providing various assistance to Ukraine, but it should also be preparing for military operations in the Northern Pacific in full cooperation with the United States. My second point regarding the response to Russian vertical horizontal escalation is that if we arrive on the verge of a spiraling escalation dynamic over Ukraine, we have to keep in mind that we have to face not only Russia, but also China. If a direct conflict erupts between Russia and the US and its allies, and the conflict expands into a major war that causes great damage to both Russia and the US and its allies, then China will gain a favorable position in the strategic competition. For now, the best course of action is probably the current course, which was reaffirmed by NATO heads of state statement, which is to provide military assistance to Ukraine, bolster defense capabilities, and maintain pressure on Russia through economic sanctions. If the current approach works to prevent Russian forces from gaining military dominance in Ukraine, that would be ideal. But what if Russian forces gradually gain military dominance inside Ukraine, even in the face of sustained military assistance by NATO and like-minded states to the Ukrainian forces? I don't really have an answer here, and I would really like to get views from other fellow panelists and participants about how we should be thinking about this difficult issue. Thirdly, as Russia becomes increasingly isolated economically, Putin could decide to intensify cyber attacks and other malicious cyber activities against sanction-imposing countries. He could use the Russian military as well as other proxies to wage cyber attacks against Western critical infrastructure. The NATO leaders stated in their joint statement that they are already enhancing their cyber capabilities and defenses, and that they are ready to impose costs on those who harm them in cyberspace. The need for collective cyber defense would become more important if Russia and also China intensify cyber attacks and other malicious cyber activities. There could be opportunities to explore new frameworks and programs for cooperation in this area. First, a possible joint statement on cyber defense signed by the United States and sanction-imposing allies could make clear that they would collectively respond with cyber and other means against Russia if it carried out cyber attacks on either one of the signatories. Second, a rapid capacity building program to strengthen cyber defense capabilities of allied states should be implemented without delay in order to reduce vulnerabilities of critical infrastructures of those allied countries. And so my last point has to do with the question of how we should prepare for a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I don't think anyone can read Xi Jinping's mind at this point, but we should probably assume that he will make his subordinates study the conflict so that they will not make the same mistakes as Putin. What is needed now are efforts to not only bolster capabilities, but demonstrate allied resolve to defend Taiwan in the event of an armed attack by China. I am not a proponent of strategic clarity because mere statements designed to deter China will not mean much if they are not backed up by actual force posture, costly capabilities, concept of operations, and firm national resolve. China will be watching not only verbal messages, but they will be watching and tracking real changes that raises the threshold for China's use of force against Taiwan. And I believe there are many tasks to be implemented so as to bolster deterrence against China, but I will just briefly mention several of them here. The US should move forward, I believe, to shift its air and naval forces toward the Indo-Pacific. B, I believe there's a possibility of forming a US, Japan, Australia 2+2, and the necessary subsidiary coordinating bodies to be established to sort of enable a more deeply integrated defense planning and coordination. And I believe this trilateral defense framework should also consult on how to bolster Taiwan's defense capabilities, which will prove critical in the event of Chinese attack on Taiwan. And I believe this would be a major challenge, but I think an option that should be explored. And I also believe this framework should also work with any European power that would be ready to engage in security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. C, Japan needs to commit to a long-term defense spending increase following the Australian and the German examples. Any figure should be driven by substantive defensive investments, but going substantially beyond the traditional 1% GDP level would signal Japanese intent to contribute more to regional deterrence. D, states imposing sanctions on Russia should form a standing coordinating body to examine and consult on possible secondary sanctions on China in the event that there are evidences that China is providing arms and other military assistance to Russia and so forth. The Russia sanction regime appears to be a new nucleus of a counter-revisionist coalition which spans across multiple regions. And E, the United States, Japan, and Australia should also respectively review their economic dependency on China and devise plans for diversification. And lastly, F, I believe we need to invigorate public debates and increase awareness of the importance of Taiwan because public opinion underwrites the credibility of deterrence. Merely finding ways to avoid the risks of escalation is probably not the right approach because it would allow the aggressor to exploit this hesitation to escalate and make threats to escalate so as to force us to back down. The risks and costs of escalation should be considered in light of what kind of world we will be living in if we succumb to Chinese domination of Taiwan by force. Appreciating the enormity of the losses and changes resulting from Chinese control of Taiwan should be the starting point from which we should determine how much risk and cost we should bear in responding to a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And political leaders must search and clarify what role their countries are ready to play at what cost in the defense of Taiwan. So these are my preliminary thoughts on some of the difficult challenges and tasks ahead, and I very much look forward to getting views from other panelists and participants during the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Mori, thank you very much. Those were very, very concrete ideas that you have. And there's many points that I think are really food for our general discussion, including especially some of your discussion on cybersecurity and the whole issue of Taiwan. But there was one issue that was more Japan specific that I did want to ask you about. You've stressed Japan should support NATO and the importance of coordination with NATO. And of course, Prime Minister Abe made a number of major advances in that area. I'm wondering what you feel ought to be done that could be easily be done to improve Japan-NATO coordination, or do you think it's operating quite well as it stands now?
Yes, I think right now there's a lot of cooperation and dialogue occurring already, and I wonder in the area of more of a hardcore defense cooperation, there might be some room to get into much more deeper defense planning coordination, perhaps, when it comes to dealing with Russia from now on. But I think the Japanese authorities are sort of exploring ways and trying to coordinate with NATO more than ever right now. So we'll have to see what comes out from this kind of new situation, a new reinvigorated dialogue between Japan and NATO. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, thank you. Looking forward to continuing on some of these questions like cybersecurity in our broader discussion. Again, thank you very much. Now, finally, as the last of our presenters, after which, of course, we do look forward to more general discussion and also involving other participants, as I see we have a number of people with tremendous background who are listening in. But we're very lucky today to have someone with us that I especially appreciate, as he's the mentor to several of our Reischauer fellows who are here at SAIS right now. Jada Fraser, for example, one of them. Professor William Min Bowden, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to SAIS and to this Kissinger Center discussion. I should just mention what most people here already do know, that you're the chair of the Clemens Center. You're the executive director of the Clemens Center for National Security at the University of Texas, Austin. You're also the editor of a publication that many of us read religiously, the Texas National Security Review, which I know several participants here on this screen have also written for. You served as Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the NSC. You have a forthcoming book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan in the White House and the World, which is going to be coming out this fall. Of course, there's many other things that I could say, but it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this panel. We look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Calder. Greetings to everyone from Austin, Texas. And yes, Jada and of course Jahan Park and several other of my former students and doctoral fellows have spoken so highly of you and your mentorship to them. And again, my thanks also to my longtime friend, Professor Frank Gavin, for convening so many of us, and of course to another longtime friend, Dean Jim Steinberg. And so SAIS is in wonderful hands there with Dean Steinberg's new leadership. So I think it's fitting that I am bringing up the anchor leg of our panel here, since I'm going to be speaking primarily with my historian's hat on, less so with my erstwhile policymaker's hat. My three previous panelists all gave wonderful and fascinating talks on different dimensions of current policy challenges and current strategy challenges, spanning, of course, the Eurasian landmass and the Indo-Pacific. I'm going to speak more historically. The title of my paper is Welcoming Japan into the Western Alliance, and it focuses particularly on this question of when and how did Japan go from rising economic power and maturing democracy into a full-fledged member of what we call the Western Alliance. And my argument essentially is that while it certainly was a product in part of structural factors such as an alignment of interests and of shared values, that it also was a function of the necessary factor of individual leadership and policy choices. And the two most decisive figures in this are both from the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan on the American side, and then Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone from Japan. And so as I want to retrace what I argue are those pivotal years, particularly with Reagan and Nakasone's leadership in welcoming Japan into a full-fledged member of the Western Alliance, no longer just the Atlantic Alliance, looking at how and why that happened. And I do think, and we can perhaps take these up during the discussion time, that there are certainly some insights for our current challenges today. Among others, of course, the 1980s was the last time the Western Alliance found itself in a superpower competition with a nuclear-armed communist adversary. Then it was the Soviet Union, of course, now China. And also it was the last time the Western Alliance found itself in a very tense standoff with the Kremlin, again, as we are today. Previously the Soviet Union, now, of course, Vladimir Putin's Russia. So a few highlights of the points which I go into in more in depth in my paper. The first is a very brief retracing of the trends in American strategic thought and policy priorities in the 1970s, partly just to show how the turn towards Japan, led by Reagan and some of his cohorts, again, was not inevitable. As different as the Nixon and Ford era and then the Jimmy Carter era were, as well as their leading statesmen such as Henry Kissinger, our namesake here, and then Zbigniew Brzezinski, one continuity, at least insofar as it came to Asia, that I see from Nixon to Ford to Carter is all three of those administrations, Republican and Democrat, privileged China more than Japan insofar as the US was looking towards Asia and saw the key to the future of Asia. It's not that they were terribly neglectful of Japan. Certainly they saw Japan as a valued alliance partner and emerging economic power, especially as the G5 and then G7 has been formed during this time with Japan as a key member. But again, more of the strategic energies were on China. China was really seen by those three administrations as the future, especially as a part of the emerging balancing coalition against the Soviet Union. And there were very good reasons for that. I am not trying to engage in armchair quarterbacking or too much hindsight bias and saying that it was a mistake. I think that made a lot of sense at the time to be focusing on China. But with the limited time and attention span that policymakers have, with limited resources, there are going to be trade-offs. And I do think that this left some strategic drift in U.S.-Japan relations, and certainly there was some neglect of Japan. And so while Reagan was a candidate in 1978, 79, and 1980, and then especially as president, he was very determined to reverse this. He really wanted to have a more Japan-first approach to America's posture in the Asia Pacific, and as I'll get to in a little bit, in turn did not just want to deepen the U.S.-Japan relationship, but also to further embed Japan in the broader Western alliance and link Japan more in with Europe as well. On the Reagan side, this is not just his idea. He had some absolutely indispensable partners, and it's a really unique quintet of 5 other American policymakers who otherwise had very little in common with each other than a shared affinity for Japan and a shared strategic prioritization of Japan. The first was U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansfield, a Democrat, of course, the longtime Senate Majority Leader who had been Jimmy Carter's ambassador to Tokyo. And in a move that had surprised quite a few people, Reagan asked Mansfield to stay on in the job. And Mansfield eventually becomes our longest serving ambassador to Japan, serving the 4 years of the Carter administration and the 8 years of the Reagan administration. And Mansfield did a tremendous amount, not just to help inform Reagan on Japan, help reinforce Reagan's strategic priorities in Japan, but bring a more of a bipartisan footing, because for any policy shift, any strategic shift to be really enduring, it needs that bipartisan foundation. The next key figure is Reagan's Secretary of State, George Schultz. Again, Reagan's second Secretary of State, replacing the hapless Al Haig beginning in 1982. And again, Schultz is also very much more of a Japan-first approach to the region. and had a fascination with Japan going back to his time as a Marine fighting in the Pacific Theater in World War II, and even before that, when he had written his senior thesis at Princeton on the U.S. posture in the Asia Pacific and seen Japan as a future key to the region. The third figure is Assistant Secretary of Defense Rich Armitage, who while working for Cap Weinberger at the Pentagon, really took the lead on U.S.-Japan defense relations. The fourth is the neoconservative intellectual and former SAIS Dean, Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. And the fifth was the longtime Japan scholar and Asia Society hand, Gaston Seeger, who was the Senior Director for Asia on the NSC staff. Again, Mansfield, Schultz, Armitage, Wolfowitz, Seeger otherwise have very little in common. We don't think of them in the same categories now as certainly today, but they all share these common convictions on the need to transform the U.S.-Japan relationship from primarily economic rivalry, economic frictions, to more of a strategic partnership. So that was on the U.S. side, and just a quote that illustrates how this certainly took Reagan's interest in elevating the U.S.-Japan relationship was initially noticed with some trepidation in Europe. Mansfield gave Reagan a line that the U.S.-Japan relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Reagan adopts and embraces that. And so when Reagan's been in office for just a few months, I'm going to read the quote here, and his good friend, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, is paying her first visit to Washington to see Reagan as the new U.S. president. The British ambassador in Washington sends Thatcher a scene center cable of read ahead, and he warns her, and I'll read this quote from her ambassador to Prime Minister Thatcher. Galling though it may be for us, we have to reckon with the fact that when the U.S. government talks of allies, they have in mind Japan just as much as Europe. So again, Europe takes notice, and of course, it'll get you in a little bit. Part of I think the strategic and diplomatic accomplishments of the Reagan administration was not to treat it so much as zero sum, but to show that in elevating the U.S.-Japan partnership, that this would also be a part of elevating the Japan-Europe partnership and broadening the Western alliance. Now, of course, this is on the U.S. side. What about on the Japanese side? Again, the really key pivotal figure here is Prime Minister Nakasone when he first takes office in November of 1982. And he likewise, from the Japan side, shared Reagan's vision for managing the economic frictions between the U.S. and Japan, and a little bit less between Japan and Europe, and elevating the strategic partnership. And I'm sure most of our I know my fellow panelists know, and most of our viewers know, that the economic frictions between the U.S. and Japan in the 1970s and 80s were very, very acute. Japan had not fully opened its markets to American exports. Japan was somewhat manipulating the value of the yen. And while American consumers were enjoying snatching up Japanese consumer electronics and automobiles, American manufacturers were feeling like they were really taken advantage of. Many American blue-collar jobs were being lost. And so there are tremendous protectionist sentiments among the American body politic, and certainly in Congress, to impose severe tariffs on Japan and force it to open its markets. And so for Reagan on the American side and Nakasone on the Japanese side, each of them had to take considerable political risks, spend considerable political capital to transform and elevate the relationship. So first, Nakasone had to persuade his legislature and his public to take some painful economic liberalization measures. And again, scholars and policymakers will still debate how far they went, but it certainly was very costly for Nakasone. Even more so, Nakasone had a very difficult job, but it was very successful in persuading his country to substantially increase its defense spending and its defense commitments, including things like moving the nautical defense perimeter out 1,000 nautical miles, and therefore freeing up the U.S. Navy to have more of a presence in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. As part of a broader maritime containment strategy against the Soviets, because Japan was now doing so much more burden sharing. Then likewise, Nakasone had a number of asks of Reagan, and Reagan had to spend considerable political capital and take a lot of heat from his own party and from his and from the Congress as well, particularly in not engaging in more draconian trade sanctions and tariffs. And Reagan would do a few tactical measures here and there, but would largely held the line and continued to try to preach the gospel of free trade to a skeptical public and to a skeptical Congress. But Nakasone saw and appreciated Reagan's considerable efforts there. Another ask of Nakasone that Nakasone made of Reagan, which is less appreciated, is Nakasone felt like for Japan to meet its security commitments and alliance commitments to the United States, that Reagan needed to help stabilize U.S. relations with China. Even though Nakasone appreciated Japan was privileging, that Reagan's privileging Japan, Nakasone knew that given Japan and China's historic animosities, that if U.S.-China relations went south after the early progress in the 1970s, that in turn would put Japan in a tough spot. And so part of why Reagan was committed to stabilizing the U.S.-China relationship was because of those entreaties from Nakasone. And finally, while Reagan was working with our European allies on deploying the intermediate-range American nuclear missiles in Europe to counter the Soviet SS-20s threatening Europe, there was an initial proposal from the Soviets, hey, we will eliminate our SS-20s targeting Europe, but we still want to leave our SS-20s in the Far East that are targeting China and Japan. And Nakasone implored Reagan, don't cut an INF deal unless the Soviets will eliminate all of them, including SS-20s in the Far East. And again, even though it dragged out those treaty negotiations for a couple more years, Reagan kept faith with his friend there. So tying this all together to the Western alliance itself, the key vehicle really is the G7. Japan was and remains, the only Asia-Pacific member of the G7. Reagan devoted considerable diplomatic and political energies to strengthening the G7. He saw it as the most important gathering of allies. And that was the main institution by which Japan was further embedded in the European alliance. And the 1983 Williamsburg G7 summit is really pivotal here, where it's the first time a G7 gathering makes a security declaration as well as an economic one. It shows tremendous Western solidarity against the Soviet security threat, and the first time that Japan explicitly ties its security to Europe's security as well. So it's no longer just about Japan-U.S. partnership in the Indo-Pacific, but Japan really having global equities and embedding its security commitments and concerns with those of the NATO powers and the Western alliance. Anyway, more that could be said, but I look forward to doing that in the discussion. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Will. Having specialized in U.S.-Japan, of course, for years and served in Tokyo, I feel, to hear you talk about that evolution and about Ambassador Mansfield and certainly the Ron Yasu relationship, that all rings very true and very important. Also, what you said about the G7, of course, it was founded in 1975. Gerald Ford was president at the time, and Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and Kissinger, of course, did have ideas, despite what happened in 1971, so China-oriented. As you know, I remember seeing this actually at the Nixon Library, that Nixon did have intention of going to Tokyo, and I think Kissinger was involved in that after a bit later on in his term. So that whole question of the China versus Japan orientation, certainly, and a very important one. And looking forward to your book, I can't resist just one brief question, bringing some of what you suggest up to the present. You mentioned G7. I wondered if you had just a few thoughts on the possible role going forward of the G7, and especially the way that it links both Japan and Europe and the United States.
Yeah, well, and again, I appreciate you bringing this up, especially because there's more in my paper and certainly in the book on the G7. And you're absolutely right about the founding of the G7 being in 1975 under President Ford, but its earliest roots seem to be in 1973 under President Nixon, when George Schultz was Secretary of the Treasury, and Schultz initially convenes, the first 4 or 5 finance ministers, and then that organically grows into the G7 under Ford. And I only mention that because later, when Schultz is Secretary of State under Reagan, for him, the G7 is not just an appealing gathering, but he feels a strong ownership on it, and especially because Japan had been a part of it from the get-go. Coming back around to your question on the present and future of the G7, I think an interesting and underappreciated episode in the G7's history was the very well-intentioned, and I supported it at the time, and I do not criticize it at all, so let me say that by private, expansion of the G7 to the G8 in the Clinton administration. And Dean Steinberg may have some recollections on that as well, where we brought Russia in. And I think it was absolutely the right move to do at the time, and it was I think a sound and realistic policy experiment of saying, can this gathering of 7 mature industrial democracies embrace a fragile and we hoped emerging transitioning democratic capitalist country in the case of Russia. Obviously, as we know, that over time that did not work out under President Putin, who later took Russia in some very unhelpful directions, eventually culminating in Russia being expelled from the G8, and now it's reverted to the G7. And so I think I bring that up by way of, in some ways, it's a reminder of what really makes the secret sauce, if you will, of the G7 is that industrialized democracy's identity. And as much as the global economy has changed so much, and democracies had a bad spell, rather than any specific policy prescriptions, I think the G7 doubling down on its original roots and original values will probably give it some more heft and ballast going forward. But
well, thank you.
I want to continue mulling that. It's a great question.
Yes, thank you. And I know we have that issue to discuss further too. Of course, we've got tremendous background on a whole range of the issues here. And we would, of course, we do have some questions for the earlier participants. In particular, I think it would be important to present one to our first speaker, Professor Henke. But I also would invite all of the other participants. I see we have so many distinguished specialists to also join us. Professor Imboden had mentioned Dean Steinberg, and of course we have Professor Gavin and so many of the participants in other sessions. And so I welcome them as well to turn their screens on, those who would like to, and hopefully we can have a bit broader discussion. But as a first question to our 2 European participants, both of course, who discussed China and its emerging role. And in Marina's discussion, it was one of various options, but she certainly noted the deep interdependence with China. And also Céline Pajon said so too. And Professor Mori was stressing Taiwan and all of the issues there. Now, to some extent, I guess, the issues across Eurasia are holistic, but I'm wondering what kind of an interaction, how do maybe the 2 of you, the Europeans first, look at the evolving sort of third country, the role of China in the Ukraine crisis, and whether Europe can possibly play a role in encouraging China toward a constructive response. I don't know, Marina, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. And, I will take a very German-based perspective, since I'm based in Berlin, and I think it might be interesting as well for you in the United States and Japan. So here, I would say, prior to the Ukraine crisis, and maybe you can go back a little bit. So that's the Trump administration. If Germany had a vote on China, it would have been, business relations continue as usual. Threat perceptions were absolutely minimal, and there was a, very strong conviction that, economic relations with China are fundamental, and even that the future of a German economic growth and technology would be in China and not in the United States. I think this is slowly shifting, but not necessarily because the perception on China has shifted, but there is a realization that this is a topic that is incredibly important to the United States. And now, of course, with Ukraine, Germans have realized how vulnerable they are and how dependent they are in the United States. And so they do realize that if they want to have US help, they need to shift on China. But let me reiterate again, there is a pushback. There is a pushback from German industries, and there is, I would say, for now, not an innate perception that actually China constitutes a military threat. And of course, I think that's kind of problematic, because there's much more of a quid pro quo logic than an actual conviction that there's a necessity.
Thank you. We would like to hear, of course, on this from Celine and Professor Mori, Professor Imboden. I would hope, I simply wish that we had more time. We have a hard stop about 7:43 or so, 7:45 in because of course then we will take a brief break, and we have a major presentation at 8 o'clock, I think, as many of you know. So the answers will need to be quick. My suggestion is very quick responses from each of our three panelists, and then I see at least 3 hands up for questions, and we probably would have to take those together. But Celine, do you have any reactions on the role of China?
Sure. I would say that the perception of China, the image of China in Europe has been deteriorated a lot in recent years, especially with the COVID, pandemics. We've seen a very aggressive kind of diplomatic push from the Chinese diplomats in several European countries. We've seen how China is trying to distort the informations, try to shape the public opinions about what is doing, what the origin of the virus, and so on. And we also realized in Europe how dependent we were on China regarding value chains, and the kind of coercive power it gives to Beijing in case of retaliations of any kind. More recently, we've seen the frictions, a big crisis between China and Lithuania, who agreed to open a diplomatic office of Taiwan on its territory, and China almost cut all the trade connections with Lithuania. China also imposed a very tough sanctions on Europeans MPs, Europeans researchers, think tanks, and all that. And so I think there has been an acceleration within Europe regarding the realization of what kind of regime China is actually
deepening
yeah.
Suspicion of China.
Yeah.
But of course, and maybe turning to Professor Mori, the issues facing Japan and Taiwan, of course, could be potentially quite immediate. At least that is the sense that I get from you. Do you have just a couple of words about how you think Japan could help to increase the understanding across the continent in Europe of the collective dangers that exist in Northeast Asia?
Yes, I think there should be a lot more discussion about the potential consequences of Taiwan falling under Chinese control. I mentioned this in the context of raising awareness inside Japan, but also I think the similar debates should also take place in Europe. Japan and the United States has been advancing contingency planning.
Implications
yes.
for Europe? Do you think it does have implications for Europe? You would like to say so, is that right?
Yes, that's right, yes.
I see. Professor Imboden, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
I have a lot, Kent, but I'm also mindful of time and that some other hands up, so I will dispense with those and go ahead and let's hear from some of our other audience.
Thank you. Sure. What I can see here, I see Dr. Corey, Professor Lind, I guess, is the first one up, and then Corey Sheikh. Please just very, very briefly, we have less than a minute each. So please, if you could just ask your questions so at least we have them out there. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a real pleasure to see you.
Hi, you too. Hi, everyone, and thank you for such wonderful talks. I'm really thrilled to be here. I had a question going all the way back to Professor Henke's talk, and I thought you were amazingly clear and laid out such interesting options. You noted an option A was a division of labor for Europe and the United States, and an option B that was about Europe taking on real security roles in East Asia. And I wonder if you could follow up on that in terms of what you think would be more acceptable to Europeans. And it's my sense that Europeans might need to be really prodded to send materials and people to East Asia when perhaps they don't see it as in their interest, but maybe the division of labor would go over better. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Thanks. And then Dr. Sheikh, and then back to our panelists for some last words.
Quick question on Professor Mori's excellent paper, which is if he could say a little bit more about the relationship between the Taiwanese government and the Japanese government, given Japan has been so forward-leaning about the defense of Taiwan.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Mori, just very briefly, and then Professor Henke.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Shaki. The relationship between the defense authorities, I think that there needs to be a much more dialogue between the Japanese government and the Taiwanese government. But so far, particularly when it comes to defense cooperation, there is no formal dialogue, as you know, between Taiwanese authorities and Japanese defense authorities. My thought is that I think we really need to involve the United States, and there should be sort of a dialogue between US and Japan, and then get Taiwanese authorities to get them involved in defense cooperation dialogues between US and Japan. So we are now exploring options and ways to sort of cooperate with Taiwan, and it's underdeveloped right now. And I think there needs to be a real effort to try to come up with some sort of framework to prepare for a potential contingency over Taiwan. And this is a major problem. Yeah, thanks.
I think a question, and this may be Professor Henke, if you and Ms. Pazion could integrate into your responses. I see a question in the chat. What do you think of the response of Europe in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? So that's a tough one, I know, but it could, perhaps to the two of you for last responses, and we have just a minute and a half.
I will be very quick. Thank you so much, Professor Lind, for your question. So, France has a relationship, historic relationship, and still, a political relationship with the Pacific. Maybe you can argue that, the Dutch as well have some kind of historic relationship, and of course, Great Britain, but they are no longer a member of the EU. Everyone else, does not have any military facilities or any, kind of a deeper, let's say, relationship or territorial relationship with Asia Pacific. And that's why, I think like this division of labor is actually something that is much more realistic. But truth to be told, like the French are pushing for an actual military role there. But, from a German perspective, that's very, very hard. In the case of Taiwan, I think the issue has become much more of a topic now of discussion. I see this, everywhere. But, in the big picture of things, the role here would be economic. It would not be military.
Do you, Celine, do you have any last thoughts as our last participant here?
Sure. Basically, I agree with Professor Henke. I think the role that the EU could play would be economic and try to design some sanction, or at least to try to make clear to China what would be the cost of any aggressive actions vis-a-vis Taiwan. And the current Ukraine crisis showed that now the EU has the tool to react quickly, and more importantly, and it's more credible, also a security partner for the country in the Indo-Pacific as well.
Well, thank you very much. I know that all of us here on the screen have learned a lot, and we appreciate these presentations, and we look forward to a stimulating conference. So, and also thanks from me too to everyone. And so we will adjourn now for 15 minutes and then reconvene at 8 o'clock sharp. Thank you, everyone.
All right, well, welcome back, everyone. That was a terrific first panel, and thank you to Kent and to the panelists for an excellent conversation and a great way to get us started. This is obviously an extraordinary moment for American national security and defense policy. Russia's brazen aggression comes at a time when there's a renewed focus on emerging threats, both geopolitical and transnational. The Biden administration has been working to shape a new national security and defense strategy, all while working with America's allies to craft effective responses to the Ukraine crisis. This is a daunting and essential task. Fortunately, the administration and the Pentagon are lucky to have a truly gifted thinker and practitioner in Dr. Colin Kahl to help lead these efforts. The Honorable Dr. Colin Kahl has served in a number of important positions. He's currently the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. During the Obama administration, he served as the Vice President's National Security Advisor, after previously being the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Colin also has a very distinguished academic career. Most recently, he was the co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. He has written numerous articles and books, including an excellent, if arresting, study with Tom Wright, Aftershocks, Pandemic, and the End of International Order, which appeared to much praise and well-deserved acclaim last year. But most important from my perspective is that Colin has been one of my closest friends for 25 years. We go way back. He's also beloved by our dog Hazy, who may or may not make an appearance at some point, so we apologize ahead of time. But I can't imagine anyone who's working harder and thinking more thoughtfully about the difficult issues that we face right now. And we could not be more grateful for you joining us this evening. So thank you for being here, Colin.
Thanks, Frank. And, we have known each other for 25 years, and it's taken a quarter century for you to call me honorable. So
it was very hard. It's stuck in my craw. But
I think you mean by that I was confirmed by the Senate as opposed to actually being honorable. But
you're very honorable. You're very honorable.
Look, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with all of you on Zoom. Wish we could be in person. But it's great to be invited to speak with all of you. This event, Europe, Japan, and the United States in a Changing World, comes at an opportune time because the challenges that Europe and the Indo-Pacific region face are daunting. But I also think there's extraordinary opportunities for us to partner across these two regions to face those challenges. The conference obviously comes at a critical moment in which the United States government as a whole, and DoD in particular, is seized with the very challenges that this conference is addressing. How do we think about a national defense strategy that addresses the pressing challenges to world order in both Europe and the Indo-Pacific? How do we harness the unified response of allied countries towards Russian aggression in Ukraine and build off of that to address other important issues and challenges moving forward? And how do the events in Europe relate to the security challenges in East Asia and vice versa? You know, I was saying to Frank, I didn't really prepare a long set of remarks. I thought maybe I'd just ask myself a provocative question and answer it, and then we can go to the questions that you actually want me to answer. But you know, we've been working on the National Defense Strategy for about a year. It has been a long and rigorous process, a lot of investigation about really mapping the contours of the current security environment, fleshing out how the Department of Defense needs to address that environment, with a cornerstone idea being this concept of integrated deterrence, which I'm happy to talk about, and what types of investments we need to make to build enduring advantage moving forward. It won't surprise anybody on this call that the focal point of the National Defense Strategy was China, and specifically China as the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense. And one of the questions that I've had posed to me in recent weeks is, yeah, but with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you must have had to start all over, right? You must have had to rip that thing up and build the National Defense Strategy from the bottom up all over again to account for this brand new world that we have entered into. So that's the question I'm asking myself. Did we have to recreate, rebuild, remake, reimagine the National Defense Strategy because of what's going on in Ukraine? The answer in a nutshell is no. And let me explain why. First, China remains the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense. Integrated deterrence remains the cornerstone concept of our National Defense Strategy. A notion of campaigning across the spectrum of competition and conflict remains central to our strategy. The need to build enduring advantage, especially by investing in the key technologies that will define the competition for the rest of this century, remains intact. And leaning into our alliances and partnerships in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe remain at the center of the National Defense Strategy. Nothing, literally nothing, about this crisis has shaken our conviction in those core elements of the NDS. Quite on the contrary, actually, it's reinforced them. Our assessment of the security environment already accounted for the type of aggressive actions that we're seeing from Russia today. In fact, the National Defense Strategy describes China as our pacing challenge, but describes Russia as an acute threat. The security assessment that our team did dating back to last year diagnosed precisely the type of threat we're seeing from Russia today. There's nothing about Russia's behavior that is out of whack with our assessment. So we were already taking Russia seriously. But while the invasion probably confirms that the NDS conclusion that Russia is an acute threat, unlike China, it cannot pose a long-term systemic challenge to the United States. It remains our assessment that China is the only country that can systematically challenge the United States across military dimensions of power, technology, economics, diplomacy, geopolitics. China in that regard is in a class on its own. Putin's invasion of Ukraine certainly demonstrates how dangerous and reckless today's Russia is. But the invasion also demonstrates real limitations of Russian power, including military power, and how isolated Putin is. In fact, paradoxically, while Russia is very much on the front pages of our news, Russia is weaker today than we would have assessed a month or 2 or 3 months ago. And while I can predict very few things with certainty about how things will end up in Ukraine, I can predict, I think, with a high degree of certainty that Russia will emerge from Ukraine weaker than it went into the conflict. Militarily weaker, economically weaker, politically and geopolitically weaker and more isolated. I also think the crisis has demonstrated a number of unmatched American strengths: our primacy in the global financial system, our alliances and partnerships, our ability, unmatched ability to rally the world to our cause. We saw the UN General Assembly, more than 140 countries vote to condemn what Russia did. Only 5 countries sided with Russia in that equation. These are the dynamics, all instruments of national power, our alliance and partnerships that the NDS leans into. And at the heart of this concept of integrated deterrence is our ability to integrate our deterrence efforts across all domains: conventional, nuclear, cyber, space, informational, integrate them across all instruments of national power, not just our military, but our ability to use diplomacy and economic tools and informational and intelligence tools, and our ability to integrate our deterrence efforts across our alliances and partnerships. And there are many attributes of that equation that have been in full display as a consequence of this crisis. So I think we're on the right track. Also, just as a matter of the types of investments that the department is making, and I won't go into too many details because I don't want to have a spoiler alert for the budget drop next week, but a lot of the investments that we're making to compete with China. So think of the investments that we're going to make in long-range fires and hypersonics and cyber and space, electronic warfare, unmanned and autonomous systems, and other emerging technologies. All these investments will also pay dividends for Russia. So to the degree that we are pacing to China, we are also making investments that allow us to deal with Russia both today and down the line. At the same time, the National Defense Strategy always recognized that in certain areas, Russia was actually the pacing challenge. And that included in areas like non-strategic nuclear weapons, the land domain, the undersea domain, and in certain conventional threats to the American homeland. So our strategy and budget was already accounting for that, and there's nothing about this crisis that has changed that. So, the good news is, I guess, that we were fairly predictive of the type of Russia we're encountering now and how that should be factored into our strategy. The bad news, of course, is that Russia is actually engaged in the activity, its brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine that kind of manifested the darkest sides of the Russia that we were assessing. But maybe with that, I'll just pause and happy to answer your questions, take the conversation wherever it's most fruitful.
Absolutely. Terrific opening to this. And I guess putting the contrarian hat on, I want to think about.
Do you have any other hat?
No, okay. That's my
Okay.
only hat. You know it well. But I'm trying to think of what would be the argument against this. And I think if you think about people like our IR friends, the defensive realist crowd, Bridge Colby, even our good colleague and friend Hal Prans, who have suggested, is it really?
Let's be clear. Hal is your friend.
Okay, no, he's not mine either. So I'm
sure somebody is a friend of Hal.
I think Corey's
somebody out
Corey's
there.
on this call. I think she owns it.
Okay, right.
But they would say, can we really afford to have two great power enemies challenging us at the same time? I think it's not a sense that I mean, I think the concern would be the Pentagon is surging resources, surging focus to the European theater, as many would see as appropriate during this crisis. But at that time, are there opportunity costs for what's happening in East Asia? Is this because by your own argument, if Russia is a declining power, as tragic as what's happening in Ukraine is, some of these people would suggest or argue, well, it's a tragedy, but there's a danger that we might lose focus on what the most important threat is. And so then the question would be, no, we can do both, or, to sort of riff off your old colleague, David Edelstein, maybe it's a time horizon approach. This is a quick upfront problem. China's a long-range problem. I mean, how would you respond to those critics who worry that you're taking the eyes off the prize to a certain extent?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, I think that the strategy describes Russia as an acute threat, which both suggests that it is significant, severe, but also in time that it is immediate. China as a pacing challenge it's a now and forever challenge. It's not that China is a challenge in the future, it's a challenge right now. It's a challenge that's going to grow and change over time. The particular deterrence challenges we may face toward the end of this decade will be different from the types of challenges we're likely to face into the 2030s and 2040s and by mid-century, when China aspires to be a global military peer of the United States. And the reality is we were always going to have to manage both of those challenges. The question is, if we were prioritizing China as our pacing challenge with Russia as an acute threat, but number two, do we somehow have to reorder that, and or is the demand signal to do things in Europe completely creating such huge opportunity costs? I don't think so. The main reason is twofold. One, for the reason that I already made, which is a lot of the investments we're making for China pay dividends for Russia and vice versa. So saying that we're pacing to China doesn't mean that we're ignoring Russia or vice versa. We're investing in capabilities that matter for both. So one of the realities that we're going to have to confront is that for the first time in our history, we're going to have two nuclear peers, right? China's in the process of tripling or quadrupling its nuclear arsenal. By the 2030s, we're going to face two countries that have nuclear arsenals that both quantitatively and qualitatively are on par with ours. And so we're making significant investments in modernizing the nuclear triad, in part because of that reality. That would be true if we only had to contend with China. It would be true if we only had to contend with Russia. It is true in the context of having to deal with both. Same in cyber and space, where both China and Russia have made significant advances. The same in terms of building the resilience of our homeland defenses and thinking actually of great power competition as a challenge to the homeland in a way, most of us, when we think about homeland security, we largely think of it as a post 9/11 counterterrorism issue, and violent extremist organizations continue to be a threat, but we are mindful of the various ways in which near-peer competitors can pose direct threats to the homeland. There is the direct opportunity cost question, which is, well, you're sending certain forces to the front lines in Europe. Does that mean they're not available for the Indo-Pacific? I would say this: we already had around 80,000 forces in the Europe in EUCOM's area of responsibility before this crisis. I think we're just slightly above 100,000 now. A lot of what we've been doing on the eastern flank has mostly been moving around forces that were already in Europe. These are also land forces, and really, when you're talking about the Indo-Pacific, it's largely a place where air, maritime, undersea, long-range fires, these types of things are most relevant. Last point: the NDS is very much about integrating our allies and partners, and there's no more capable multilateral alliance in the world than NATO. And the one thing that, there were many miscalculations that Vladimir Putin had, but among them was that he woke NATO up. And if he believed that he could engage in this crisis and drive a wedge through the NATO alliance, create all these divisions, if he thought that NATO was wobbly, if he thought that Germany had a new government, they won't be serious, the French won't be serious, there's an energy crisis in Europe, nobody's going to get their act together, he badly miscalculated. And just think what's happened since in the past month. The aggression on Ukraine has led to a German government that's going to double its defense budget. Right. Countries like Sweden and Finland, who have long been neutral, are trending towards NATO. NATO has put a lot more forces closer to Russia, not further away. And so the reason I emphasize that is we're not alone in Europe. We have an extraordinary number of capable allies that are there right alongside us to meet this challenge. So it's not all going to fall on America's shoulders. I'll just give you one data point. We have surged additional forces into Poland as a consequence of this crisis. We now have 10,000 forces in Poland. Poland has 120,000 forces in Poland. So these are real allies, real capable countries. And so I think we will be able to walk and chew gum and prioritize China as our pacing challenge while being cognizant of the threat that Russia poses.
Let me flip this then. Again, given that we gave Corey's good friend Hal a hard time, he wrote an outstanding paper for this that previewed.
Outstanding. I heard it was long.
It was long. It was
outstanding. The same thing.
It was outstanding despite being long.
Okay, good.
but it previewed what a China-U.S. war would look like, and made the argument that a lot of us are fooled into thinking it would be a short war, or that somehow the international system would prevent the war from happening. And it's a bracing, terrifying read. And you read it, and you think to yourself, watching what Putin is doing in Russia, both how horrific it is, but how poorly it's gone. One wonders if in Beijing, this doesn't say, okay, maybe we should rethink some things. But it would also happen on the US side too, right? And so I guess the question is, I know this is more under the realm of diplomacy than defense, but clearly US-China relations have been terrible in recent years. Clearly being identified as the pacing threat is language that indicates things could go really badly. Is there anything about this horrible moment that perhaps generates at least some possibility, as speculative as it might be, to make sure the US-China relationship doesn't go in the same direction that it went with Russia, either on the national security or the strategy side?
Yeah, it's an important question. I would just say this: we are very careful on the language that we choose in the national defense strategy. We do not describe China as the pacing threat. China is our pacing challenge, okay. And those words actually mean very different things. Russia is an acute threat. China is the pacing challenge, and the reason we describe China as the pacing challenge is because it's a competitor. That's not a newsflash to anybody. It's certainly not a newsflash to anybody in Beijing. And they're the only competitor capable of challenging us across the board, militarily, technologically, diplomatically, economically, geopolitically. But we are also very clear that a conflict with China is neither inevitable nor desirable. It certainly wouldn't be in their interest. It wouldn't be in the world's interest. It wouldn't be in our interest. I think we all would like to have it not happen. The focus of the document is on how you build a deterrence environment such that China is dissuaded from engaging the type of aggression we're now seeing in Europe that would seek to overturn the security order in the Indo-Pacific in the way that Russia is trying to overturn it in Europe. That would challenge a lot of the underlying norms and principles that undergird the kind of rules-based international order that has contributed to so much stability and prosperity for the United States and our allies and partners. So we're very much focused on deterrence, not conflict, with China. I will say, though, that, look, China's going to draw its own conclusions. But if I was sitting in Beijing right now looking at what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'd have to ask myself some questions, right? So Russia has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in modernizing their army on paper. Turns out it's really hard. Yeah. It's really hard to do these things. It's really hard to fight a modern, information-centric, networked, joint war. It's really hard. Now, Russia has done things in Georgia, it's done things in Syria, it obviously intervened in Ukraine in 2014, but nothing on this scale. So they engaged in this large-scale gamble, believing that the military they had on paper was going to perform, and it didn't. And so the question, I think, the United States has essentially been at war for 20 years. Now, different types of adversaries, different environments, but we've road tested, we've kicked the tires on a lot of this stuff. Nobody else has done that. And so I think the question that some folks in Beijing might ask is, well, okay, we look pretty good on paper, but a lot of times, I'm a football fan. A lot of times in the preseason, you're like, these two teams have the two best rosters. Doesn't mean they're going to make it all the way to the Super Bowl. All right, so I do think they're going to have to ask the question: if this stuff turns out to actually be hard, and the Russians are demonstrating that. I also think they have to ask themselves why their intelligence was so bad. I do not think that China believed that Putin was going to invade Ukraine in the way that he did. I think that Putin probably told Xi Jinping around the time right before the Beijing Olympics that they were just going to do a minor humanitarian intervention in the Donbass, and I think Putin just lied to his face, and that Xi Jinping, I don't think, had any other sources of information that contradicted that. I'm sure he looked at us and thought that all of our warnings about what Russia was going to do was Western propaganda and all the rest, and it turns out we were right. And there's a bit of that where, some of the hangover from Iraq WMD in 2003 has been completely turned on its head, because not only was our intelligence right, but the way that we shared intelligence and downgraded intelligence to help shape this huge coalition that is now, taking Ukraine's side in this equation and joining with us. And that coalition, by the way, includes a lot of our friends in the Indo-Pacific. So China has to ask, well, why isn't our intelligence that good? And boy, the Americans, they seem to know a lot. What do they know about us? And then, of course, there's the diplomatic and economic response, which I think has really blown back Putin's hair. And kind of, I think of the old Maxell commercial with the speaker blowing the hair back. But I don't think Putin anticipated that he would be as isolated, that he would be as instantaneously turned into a global pariah, that the economic sanctions would be as quick, massive, and that so many countries would join on, to include countries very far afield like Japan. And I think China has to take note of that, because I think part of the calculation, as China might contemplate aggression, could be across the Taiwan Strait, could be in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or elsewhere, would be, essentially, can we do to Taiwan what we did to Hong Kong, right? Which is kind of snuff out a vibrant democracy, try to forcefully incorporate them, and the world will just kind of move on. And I think what the Ukraine situation is demonstrating is the world will not move on. That a world will in fact rally against the aggressor, and that the United States is uniquely situated to make that happen. And so that has to affect the cost-benefit calculus. Last but not least, it turns out that the target of aggression has agency. And in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Ukrainians have shown tremendous tenacity, creativity, courage, and they've also demonstrated that, a country that uses small unit tactics and mobility and has access to advanced asymmetric capabilities can actually tie a nuclear superpower in knots on the ground. And so, if that's the case in a land war in Europe, one has to say, what would happen in the context of an amphibious invasion in the Indo-Pacific? Those are the most complicated logistical exercises that one can imagine. And if the Ukraine crisis has proven anything, it turns out logistics matters. So that's all to say, not to be sanguine about it, but that I think actually what's happened in Ukraine and the response of the world has to be sobering for others who might be contemplating similar actions.
So this is a great point. Do you have a broader hypothesis or set of hypotheses for why the Russian military did as poorly as it did? You had mentioned earlier, and I think it deserves note, the administration did an extraordinary job of gathering intelligence, uniquely and innovatively declassifying it in a way to bring together the allies and to convince people that this was going to happen, when a lot of people, most people, thought this invasion wasn't going to happen. It's an enormous success. On the other hand, my sense is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the intelligence didn't predict that Russia's military would perform as poorly as it did, nor did it predict the Ukrainians would fight as well as they did. And I guess I'm wondering, what are your hypotheses about this ineffective performance? How unique are they to Russia? How are they unique to kind of modern warfare in 2022? How unique are they to, say, authoritarian states who haven't fought, like you said? Because Russia, unlike China, has had some military experience recently, but it has been an extraordinary failure. I mean, I think beyond what anyone could have imagined, and it appears to continually be getting worse. And I'm wondering, what do we take away from this for thinking about the battlefield? Future battlefields?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're a month in, right? So you're a historian, you think in terms of centuries, and we're a month in. So I think we all have to be humble that we don't know, and we won't know for a while. I probably won't tell you anything you wouldn't learn from folks like, Michael Kaufman on Twitter. But I'll say this. My sense was that the entire invasion was premised on the most fantastical, magical thinking about how Russian forces would be greeted as liberators. I mean, it's like a cartoonish version of the assumptions prior to the 2003 Iraq invasion. It is, I think we all saw in the days right before the invasion that Vladimir Putin spoke from his heart, and he, basically just doesn't think Ukraine's a real country. Right. So he imagined that all Ukrainians are essentially Russians, and would, that were somehow oppressed by a bunch of thugs and drug dealers and Nazis, which anyway, it's so bizarre, but apparently Putin believed it. And that they could, the Russian military could do their version of the Thunder Run on Baghdad, where they just zoomed right down the highway. Airborne troops would land at the airport, some mechanized units would get in, some Spetsnaz and FSB folks would essentially decapitate the government in Kyiv, replace it with some of their, minions, and voila, regime change. It was a huge miscalculation of the Ukrainian will to fight, the reality of Ukrainian nationalism, and a huge overestimation, I think, of Russia's capabilities to do these types of operations at scale. I think that they have shown their ability to do it in smaller numbers, in hybrid warfare contexts, but I mean, they've not done this with 150,000 forces before. I also think that in a paradoxical way, we seem to know more about their plans than the Russians themselves did, in the sense that I think we were very accurate at describing what the Russians intended to do, or what at least Putin intended to do, how he intended to array his forces, how he intended to go after Kyiv. Nobody, or not a lot of people, believed us. And I just don't think that Putin and his inner circle shared the plans with very many people. So I think that there were, of those 30,000 troops that were in Belarus, I think a lot of those guys were pretty convinced they were just there for an exercise, and didn't know that they were going to Ukraine until they were on their way. And so they didn't really plan and train for the type of encounter that they were going to have. And then I think I think we'll have to ask ourselves questions about how much of that money they've invested was siphoned off by corruption, how much of it is that the way they built their military was inherently flawed, that it was inappropriate for this type of fight, that they just didn't have experience in joint warfare or networked warfare. And so, I guess the good news is they've struggled immensely. The bad news is because they've struggled immensely, they've kind of fallen back on their old playbook, which is to kind of try to do to places like Mariupol what they have done, in places like Aleppo and Grozny. And I do worry that, the good news is I don't think the Russians are capable of achieving their maximalist objectives in Ukraine. Like, if the idea was to execute a regime change and replace the government and end a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine, that's not going to happen. There's a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine is going to endure, but the Russians are going to try to pummel what's left into submission in the worst and most horrific ways. And the other piece of this is they're running out of precision guided munitions. So just as a matter of what they have in the tank, they're more likely to rely on thumb bombs and artillery, and so unfortunately it's continues to be a very grisly and brutal conflict. So I mean, I think what we can hope for is that Putin will recognize that he can't achieve his objectives, and that he will negotiate some exit for himself.
So you've been a scholar of nuclear strategy, of nuclear dynamics. You've thought about this quite a bit. I don't think the idea that a nuclear power would be launching a massive land war in Europe was not something that we really had thought about. We thought that was in the past. And so I guess I'm interested in a couple of dimensions of what you mentioned, one narrow, one more broad. The narrow one is how you're thinking about escalation dynamics, what your current thinking is, how it differs from what you thought in the past, what you're seeing, what you're worried about. Clearly, Putin has made some threats. He's often been irresponsible with his rhetoric when it comes to nuclear weapons. This is obviously it's hard to imagine, to your point, a Russia, while having that capacity, ever just fully giving up or losing, right? But so I guess how you think about the nuclear dimension of this. I'll leave it at that. I've got a broader nuclear question about how this has changed your thinking about the utility of nuclear weapons in international affairs. But just in terms of this, the dynamics in this crisis, what has surprised you? What are you worried about? What are you less worried about? How would you frame the issues that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that the crisis has increased the salience of nuclear weapons in just our everyday conversation about the world to a level that we haven't seen since probably the early 1980s.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's new. It just means we forgot.
Right.
It's like the Christopher Columbus problem. Just because it seems new to you doesn't mean that it's actually new. So it may seem new to you, but it's not not you.
Yeah.
But it may seem new to you, but it's not actually new. So it's just that we haven't experienced it in a long time. And I think what we're seeing now, you mentioned our IR friend, so I can use a nerdy concept. We're seeing a version of the stability and stability paradox, right? That you have a country that perceives that its nuclear arsenal generates a degree of strategic stability, or at least the ability to preclude the big war, but frees it up to use its nuclear deterrent as a shield under which it can engage in all sorts of aggression. Now, Russia's been doing this for a long time. They've just been doing it with little green men and trying to meddle in elections and raids and incursions and support for Assad and other things. They haven't done it in the massive conventional invasion that we're seeing. So that pieces of it is new. But this notion that they haven't hid behind their nuclear arsenal before to enable them to do things that other countries might not be able to get away with, I don't know that that's new. But anyway, it is particularly acute right now. It is a dynamic that our assessment of the security environment in the National Defense Strategy was already highlighting long before this crisis, but it's been kind of punctuated by this crisis. I think the challenge that we're facing on an escalation front, and this doesn't reveal anything classified, is that Russia has a particular doctrine about nuclear weapons, and they rely on their nuclear weapons in large part, to offset for their perceived conventional inferiority vis-a-vis the United States and NATO. Now, they, I think, also saw themselves closing the gap conventionally between the United States and NATO. I think this conflict has revealed that gap remains pretty sizable in many respects. So their tendency to lean on nuclear weapons as kind of their offset to that, I think, could be aggravated by this. We also know just from kind of published Russian doctrine that they have a lower threshold for using nuclear weapons, that they could consider using non-strategic nuclear weapons, which is a bit of a misnomer because some of these things are like Hiroshima-sized bombs. So we shouldn't think of these as like small nuclear weapons. But using them in a kind of a tactical environment, that, if they believe that they face all-out military defeat, that might be one threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, or if they believe a direct threat to the Russian state, that might be another threshold. And so, I think we're mindful of that reality. That doesn't mean we're going to be intimidated from pushing back against Russia. It just means we are going to be disciplined about how we do it. And so I think President Biden from the outset has said, look, we're not going to put US forces or NATO forces into Ukraine. We don't want World War III. We don't want a direct confrontation between us and the Russians. But we are going to stand up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity that underpin the rules-based international order. We are going to support Ukraine so that it emerges as it endures as a sovereign, independent, democratic country. So we have provided extraordinary amounts of security assistance. We did that before the crisis, sometimes quietly, sometimes with more fanfare. We've done it in an extraordinary amount in the past month. I think people saw the announcement last week of essentially $1 billion of new security assistance on top of the $1 billion we had provided them over the previous year. And the type of stuff that we've been providing them in terms of air defense systems, man-portable air defense systems, and anti-armor systems have paid enormous dividends on the battlefield. So, I think you've heard that the administration pour some skepticism on things like no-fly zones that would involve direct US or NATO intervention into the conflict. mindful of the escalation dynamics, while also not being intimidated by the Russians from supporting Ukraine. And that's how we are trying to manage this. But every day we talk about these escalation dynamics in the Pentagon with the Secretary, with the Chairman, the Joint Chiefs, and the other senior leaders in the building. So we were watching this every day, and obviously the folks across the river are watching it just as closely.
Is there? It strikes me that there's a kind of it's more of an art than a science, the sensitivity to escalation dynamics. And you mentioned the enormous support that the Biden administration and Western countries have given to Ukraine. I'm sure it seems surprising that Russia has done so little to stop that. And when I think about this, you think about, okay, every day that goes by, the West, the United States thinks, okay, we've moved a little closer. There's been no escalation. You can push more and more. Are there dangers on two sides? One, that there's a day that Russia suddenly says, you know what, they've already launched one attack. There was no follow-up on this, but maybe they hit a basing depot in Poland or something like that, not just near Poland, but in Poland, or they start attacking places and things and items where we're getting in and American lives are at risk. Relatedly, and I know this is a somewhat distant question, but I'm sure alliance management is an important challenge here. There might be some of our allies who might be more forward-leaning and more risk-tolerant on the escalation side, willing to do some things that at some point might hit that line. So I wonder how you think about those two dynamics. Is there a day that all of a sudden Russia wakes up and says, we're actually, this lethal aid is really bad, we're going to do everything we can to stop it, or one of our allies does something that we don't have full control over that kind of pulls us in? How are you thinking about those problems?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the Russians have said publicly that they consider aid convoys legitimate targets. So they are mindful of security assistance flowing into the country, however it gets into the country. And they may try at some point to go after those convoys. NATO forces are not bringing that equipment into the country, so this doesn't. They're attacking Ukrainians all over the country. If they find Ukrainian arms shipments, no matter where they are, they may attack them. I think that is a risk inherent in this conflict. We've seen some strikes out in the western part of Ukraine. I think for the moment, it's been more difficult for the Russians to operate persistently out there, in large part because they haven't, despite the fact that they have an overwhelming number of planes vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, they haven't established air superiority across the whole country because the Ukrainians have been good in using the air defense systems that they have and keeping them safe, moving them around, using them effectively. I think you might have noticed when the Russians about a week ago hit an old training facility near the Ukraine-Poland border. It's a place called Yavoriv. Killed a couple dozen Ukrainians. It was a horrific attack. They fired those missiles from the Caspian Sea. They didn't fly their planes over to Western Ukraine. So I think that they are using standoff munitions to reach out, but that has certain limits in their ability to do things that they may want to do. So that could change. Who knows? But I think actually the Russians. I don't think Vladimir Putin wants to invite an all-out conflict against NATO. I think he has to know that would not work out well for him. If they're struggling this much inside Ukraine, with 80% of their land forces committed to this fight, I just don't see how he could make the calculus that it would be a wise move to take on NATO. Our president has been very clear that we are committed to defending every inch of NATO. That was reconfirmed today during the Leaders Summit in Brussels. And so I think that Putin very much understands that striking NATO territory would not be in his interest. So never say never. He's proved reckless, but I think it would be a very grave miscalculation piled on top of other miscalculations. At the moment, I think NATO is not only unified, but the consultation has been pretty good about what we're doing inside Ukraine, and I suspect it'll stay that way.
So I want to encourage our participants, if they want to send questions, and also see if I can figure out how to use the Q&A thing here. We have a few questions here. But one of the big issues in this conference is, of course, the issue of how different allies have responded. And I think the European response, as you noted, has been extraordinary and unexpected, and really a real pivot point. I also think, in a way that's less recognized but equally as important, has been Japan's response. But I wonder, how should we think about countries that maybe have not responded in as fulsome a way? You know, sort of the Indias, the Gulf states, is this how, especially, we're talking a lot about the Indo-Pacific, we're talking about how is this just sort of the nature of international politics? States do these things, or is this kind of one of these pivot moments where there's an expectation that, you've got to kind of figure out about picking sides? I mean, how are you thinking about, obviously probably impressed and thrilled with the positive response. How should we think about states who've not necessarily been as enthusiastic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that this is something that'll have to play out over time. And you're right. I mean, look, the world is a complicated place. People have multiple relationships with countries that are, with other countries that are adversaries. And a lot of times smaller countries try to keep their head down and stay out of it. So I think there are certainly some countries who just don't want to get in the middle of it, or countries that have a long tradition of neutrality that they want to pursue in this conflict. India's obviously got not only a strong track record of kind of non-alignment, but it has a lot of Russian military equipment. Right. They have also a particular relationship with Russia that they may perceive as somewhat of a counterweight vis-a-vis countries like China. So we understand. That said, I think the choices are getting starker, and Putin's transgression of the foundational norms that underpin the modern international order is so profound. A large-scale invasion, completely unprovoked, completely under fabricated pretext that nobody believed, except maybe some folks in Russia itself, to invade and violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of an independent nation and a democratic nation. It's just beyond the pale. And then you compound that with how the Russian forces are actually comporting themselves, and the bombardment of cities and the effect that it's having. I mean, 1 out of 4 Ukrainians has been displaced, including something like 3.5 million outside the country. It's the speed and rapidity of the humanitarian crisis is extraordinary. And so I think most of the world is understandably appalled. And the other thing is, enough of the world has, labeled Russia as a pariah state and backed that up with real biting sanctions that will apply to countries that do business with them. The US sanctions don't just apply to Russia, they will apply to anybody who does business with these banks or with these oligarchs. Our export controls also apply. And so I think it'll be less and less tenable, especially the longer this conflict goes, for countries to kind of play the middle ground. I think at some point, countries will probably have to choose, and that's an uncomfortable reality. But I think it's just that's the moment we're in, that it'll be harder and harder to play the middle.
So I don't want to dominate here. The only person you've known almost as long as me is Professor Lin. So I expect her to call. And unless I cannot imagine Dr. Shaki does not have a question at some point. But Professor Nakayama has been very patient. So why don't we turn it over to him for a question, and then I'll turn to Professor Lin.
Thank you. Good evening from Tokyo. My name is Toshi Nakayama, Keio University and Japan Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for your insights and analysis. You sort of answered my question in your response to Professor Gavin, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's slightly different. And I was relieved to hear Indo-Pacific focus would be retained and that China would be treated as a pacing challenge, whereas Russia as an acute threat. But I think this argument is premised or underlying assumption is that Russia would change after Putin. And recently I've been reading and hearing this theory about Russia sort of remaining Russia. And this war is not really about Putin, but more a manifestation of Russia's view of the world and its place sort of in the world. And declining power could be even more dangerous because it doesn't really care about reputation, whereas China does. So is there a danger of underestimating longer-term threat of Russia? And if Russia remains a constant threat rather than acute/temporary threat, would that change the calculation that we just outlined? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, I think for the foreseeable future, I think we'll be contending with Putin's Russia. Our policy is not one of regime change. Our policy is one of behavior change. So, I don't think we're really banking on kind of post-Putin Russia in our strategy. I think we're strategizing against Putin's Russia. Just my inclinations are not to be too, I'm not saying you are this way, but it's not to be too culturally or, reductionist in the sense that, there's some innate properties of countries that are unchangeable no matter what. And I know there are some Russia scholars who feel that way. I suspect there are others who feel differently, and I'm not really well equipped to weigh in on that. But I think the point that you make, which is certainly true, and to say that it's an acute threat is actually not to suggest it's temporary. It just means that it's particularly pronounced in the moment. But I think no, Russia is first of all, Russia is a huge country. It will, it has enormous oil and gas resources. It will be, it's an energy superpower. It has, it has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It obviously feels inclined to be able to throw that nuclear arsenal around and use it coercively in ways that a lot of other countries would not be willing to do. Its military is struggling in Ukraine, but it is still a very capable military that will pose a very significant challenge to the European security order for the foreseeable future. So it's not like, I hope I didn't leave the impression that, if we kind of get beyond the next couple of years, we'll be fine with Russia. I think that's probably not the case. We're going to make the types of investments pacing to China that will allow us to also contend with Russia that continues to be a significant challenge to our national interest beyond the Ukraine crisis. And there are also some ways, as I mentioned, where Russia itself is the pacing challenge over the next decade in things like non-strategic nuclear weapons, the undersea domain, the land domain, and our budget will reflect the priorities there. So, we will prioritize to China and the Indo-Pacific, but we will be very mindful of what we need to do to contend with Russia now and into the future. And the last point I will make is just to reiterate something I said earlier, which is, a huge benefit we have in Europe is that we're not there by ourselves. We're not taking on Russia by ourselves. We're there alongside the strongest military alliance in the history of the world. And I think we are at an inflection point with NATO where this 2% pledge that everybody made in 2014 at Wales, which has been agonizing for a lot of our allies to meet, I believe that's going to start to become a floor, not a ceiling for the alliance. And I think that even countries, and you've heard this from our German friends who have said, they've invested a lot in their military budget is, not all that dissimilar from Russia's, but they haven't actually invested in the type of kind of combat credible capability that I think they are now grappling with. So I think it's not just that countries will be spending more, but they'll be buying more of the right things. And I think the alliance will come together more. And that is also real power that doesn't rely solely on the United States, carrying the full load.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor Lin, do you have a question or a comment for your old friend Colin?
Of course, for the Honorable Colin Call. Thank you so much for joining us. And I was just wondering if you could comment on some of the themes that came up in the previous panel, which is about a potential division of labor between the US and Europe with respect to Asia. As you're talking to our partners in both regions, what kind of role do you see for Europe in terms of managing the China challenge? Is it one where they are handling the European side of things, or are they being involved kinetically in any sort of East Asia operations that would happen? Or would it be, an area that's really important to talk about is the contribution of Europe in the technological sense and the economic sense, which they would be vital partners in. And so if you could comment on that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we don't know for sure, obviously. And I think the one thing we can predict is that, the Russian invasion will make Europeans very focused on what's happening in Europe. So it raises the question of how do Europeans think about China in Europe? I think my guess is that increasingly it'll be thought of in two ways. One is in the non-military dimensions in which China's influence in Europe could be counterproductive for European security. So unfair trade practices, China's desire to dominate key technologies, but also, frankly, the norms and rules around those technologies in ways that are not compatible with Western values. What China is doing in the cyber domain to crawl inside the networks inside Europe to exfiltrate trade secrets and intelligence and do things. China's desire to use technology-empowered surveillance. There's all sorts of ways in which I think Europe will be a front line really for the inherent tension between liberal democratic values and China's desire to make the world safe for the CCP, which is not, I don't think, compatible with the values at the heart of the European Union or Europe more broadly. I do think, though, that there is a security dimension even in Europe, which is that I think Europeans are waking up to the prospect of a tightening alignment between China and Russia. So even as Russia elevates its, the sense of threat in Europe, I think there's also a sense that, just kind of in the language of balance of power politics, right? Enemy, my enemy is my friend type of thing, that the Russians and that Russia and China were already moving closer together and kind of to push back against their perception of U.S. primacy and their desire to establish a multipolar world and all of that. And I actually think that the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and the export controls that have been imposed on Russia arguably force them to lean on China even more. And so there is a possibility that kind of relationship without bounds, the kind of BFF relationship that Xi and Putin signaled on the eve of the Beijing Olympics, maybe that gets tighter, which means that even a Europe that's more focused on Russia has to be more mindful of China. And actually, I think we're seeing that right now, which is that, we do know that China is thinking of ways that they can help prop up Russia's economy, that China is contemplating whether they should be trying to quietly provide military support to Russia. Well, that's a very complicated equation if China wants to have a relationship with Europe. So I do think that there's a degree to which what Putin has done in Ukraine makes Russia much more of a strategic burden for Beijing than it was 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago. And that'll play out in no small part in Europe. But there's the flip side of the equation too, which is that I don't think that Europe will abandon the Indo-Pacific. I actually think that, there are a number of European countries that have profound interests in the Indo-Pacific. This was manifest in the agreement last year between the United States, the UK, and Australia, AUKUS, which really helps cement, one of our closest allies in Europe to one of our closest allies in the Indo-Pacific in this trilateral framework on submarine development and other high tech, and it's really a focal point around which to do a lot of security matters. But France is also a Pacific power, and you know, our French allies were not super pleased about AUKUS, but they have their own relationships in the Indo-Pacific that aren't going to go away, and are very keen to have more cooperation with India and more cooperation with Japan and more cooperation trilaterally between France, India, and Japan. And so, you know, this, I don't have to tell you, you've forgotten more about this than I will ever know, but the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific is very different. And I think it'll be kind of reconfigurable and kind of different coalitions centering around different things. And, you know, the Quad will do certain things and AUKUS will do certain things. And, the United States will do certain things just with Japan and Australia, and France will do certain things with India, and it'll also do other things, you know. So I think that you're not going to see Europe disinterested from the Indo-Pacific, and to include in the military domain, and that you're likely to continue to see French and UK and the occasional German military deployments in the Indo-Pacific, even as Russia is very kind of front of mind.
So I think it's very appropriate that the final question be given to our good friend, Dr. Corey Shockey.
So nice to be in your company, my friends. So Colin, I too have a question about allies and inflection points, because it looks to me like America's relationship with the countries of the Gulf is probably unrecoverable. The combination of the behavior of the Saudi crown prince, the activation of civil society in response to those actions, you know the list better than I. I have my doubts that relationship can actually continue to be a constructive one for either party. And I wonder how that affects your strategy if the UAE and Saudi and possibly even Qatar have very different kinds of relationships with the United States. Because it looks to me from the point in the previous administration where there were physical attacks on those countries that we didn't respond to, that we've been on a toboggan ride to a very different kind of relationship since then, and it hasn't been recovered in the Biden administration.
Yeah, it's an important question. I do think there's clearly, turbulence. I don't think there's any way I don't think we should sugarcoat that. I think, as your question pointed out, it's not a brand new thing. It's something that's goes back. Where you date it, maybe you date it maybe one can date it to the Arab Spring as a starting point for some disagreements. Obviously our relationships with our Gulf partners are largely rooted in a set of common interests. And then, begs the question, how many of those interests persist? I think a lot. My own view is that a lot of those interests continue to persist. We have a common interest in combating violent Islamic extremism in the form of, ISIS and Al-Qaeda offshoots. We have an interest, I think, in pushing back against Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. There are threats to shipping and the free flow of oil and gas resources to the world economy through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. We face common threats in the region. We have troops in Iraq and Syria. We have thousands of troops in Qatar and in the UAE. And we have troops in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. We face common threats from Iranian proxies who are using, one-way kamikaze UAVs and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And so, I still think we have a lot of common interests. I can't speak to, their views about American staying power in the region or where they see things going. We provide a lot as a security partner and guarantor for them that it's hard for me to imagine they can get from somebody else. It's not clear to me it would be in their interest. So, I understand the desire to engage in some hedging and cover their bets, but it doesn't strike me that it's in their interest to make a hard pivot But the Middle East definitely has a different place in American grand strategy than was the case in the years following 9/11, where it was the focal point for American grand strategy. I think we'd all be lying if we said it's the focal point now. It's not. The Indo-Pacific and Europe are clearly the priority theaters for U.S. grand strategy. But that doesn't mean that we're abandoning the Middle East. We have 35,000 troops in the Middle East right now. We have extraordinary combat power in the Middle East. We are a safeguard for a lot of things that would be a lot worse if we weren't there. So I don't want to sugarcoat the friction points. They exist, but I also think there are things that we can work through. And I think hopefully all sides recognize the alternative is worse. So we'll get through it. I would say it's a time of transition, but it need not be a time of kind of a rupture in the fundamental relationships.
Well, I think we could continue this excellent conversation for hours to come, but the Honorable Dr. Call has been hard at work on a variety of incredibly important things, and we are just so grateful for you making the time to be with us today. And I don't know how one does applause anymore on Zoom, but thank you very much. Terrific comments. Thank you for making the time and for this event, and absolutely terrific. And that brings to a close our first day, what I think was an outstanding start. A reminder, we begin early tomorrow at 8 a.m. With three outstanding grand strategists, John Bew from the United Kingdom, Justin Weiss from France, and America's own Mira Rapp-Hooper. So please join us tomorrow at 8 a.m. And thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.